In the winter of 1952, London woke to a fog that felt different. Not the familiar mist that rolled in from the Thames, soft and pale and harmless, but something heavier, thicker, darker, a fog that swallowed light, muffled sound, and hung in the air like a curtain no wind could move. At first, no one paid attention. London had lived in smoke and soot for centuries. Coal fires burned in almost every home. A little haze was nothing new. People wrapped their scarves, lit their morning cigarettes, and stepped into the streets as if it were any ordinary day. But within hours, the city began to vanish. Lamp posts disappeared behind a yellow wall. Buses halted in the middle of the road because drivers could no longer see the ground beneath their feet. At theaters, the fog seeped inside, drifting through aisles and over seats until the audience could no longer see the actors on the stage. Hospitals filled with coughing patients. The air grew sharp, metal, bitter, hot in the lungs, and still no one understood what was happening. For 4 days, London lived inside a cloud of poison, a smog so dense it blotted out the sun, so lethal it took thousands of lives quietly, without warning, without mercy. A disaster not born from fire or flood, but from the simple act of breathing. This is the story of the Great Smog of 1952, how it formed, how it killed, and how it changed the world forever. A story of a city that disappeared, and the silence that settled where the light once stood. Close your eyes, slow your breath, and let the fog roll in. In the years after the Second World War, London was a city rebuilding itself in slow, deliberate steps. The scars were everywhere. Empty lots where buildings had once stood, patched roofs, long queues for food, and streets still marked by the weight of rationing. But beneath the surface of exhaustion lay something constant, something older than the war or the men who fought it, the air itself. London lived in coal. Coal burned in power stations along the Thames. Coal burned in trains pulling into Waterloo and Paddington. Coal burned in factories tucked between rows of brick houses. And most importantly, coal burned in almost every home. Tens of thousands of fireplaces lit each morning to take the edge off the cold. The smoke drifted upward into the sky, mixing and settling into a haze that Londoners simply accepted as part of life. Fog had always been a character in the city's story. Painters captured it, writers romanticized it, visitors expected it. A gray veil that softened the edges of buildings and made the gas lamps glow in a way that felt unmistakably, almost comfortingly London. Even after the war, when coal quality plummeted and smog became harsher, people adapted. A cough was normal, a sting in the eyes was normal, a day when the air felt like it had weight was normal. Londoners wrapped scarves around their faces, muttered about the weather, and continued on with their errands. The government knew the air wasn't clean, but the problem was old, familiar, and politically inconvenient. Electricity demand was rising, homes needed heating, the nation's supply was limited, so cheaper, dirtier coal filled the gaps. Smoke control measures existed, but enforcement was inconsistent. Solutions cost money, and Britain was still counting every pound. By late autumn of 1952, the cold settled earlier than usual. People burned more coal, factories extended their hours, a temperature inversion, a rare combination of still air and warm air trapped above cold, had begun forming over the Thames Valley. Meteorologists noted it, but saw nothing extraordinary. London had seen stagnant fog before, and so on the morning of December 5th, the city woke to a pale curtain of mist rolling along the river, the sort of fog that Londoners walked through without a second thought. Light, familiar, harmless. The buses ran, shops opened, children went to school. People lit their fireplaces, warming small rooms with coal that smoked more than it burned. The first signs were subtle, a faint, acrid smell that clung to scarves and coats, lamp posts turning fuzzy at the edges, car headlights forming halos instead of beams, but nothing that suggested danger, nothing that hinted at what the next few days would unleash. For now, London breathed as it always had, deeply, unconsciously, and without fear. The fog thickened slowly, quietly, gathering strength in the spaces between chimney stacks and narrow streets. It drifted low, hugging the ground in a way that seemed merely curious, nothing more. No alarms were raised, no warnings were issued. The city carried on as if the air itself had not already begun to change. In the distance, above the rooftops, a pale sun tried to break through the haze. Its light hit the fog, softened, and disappeared. By evening, the streets were dimmer than usual. Headlights glowed weakly. People squinted to see across the road. London had slipped into the first hours of a disaster no one recognized. Not yet, not until the fog refused to lift. Through much of early December 1952, London's weather followed a simple pattern: cold nights, weak daylight, and a persistent chill that settled deep into the bones of the city. It was the sort of cold that made coal stoves indispensable. People burned whatever they could: cheap coal, leftover briquettes, damp fuel stored through summer, even scrap wood when supplies ran thin. Each fire released a thick plume of smoke, rising into the morning air in slow, uneven spirals. Normally, the smoke drifted upward and dispersed across the sky. But during the first week of December, the atmosphere changed in a way few noticed at the time. A temperature inversion formed, a layer of warmer air resting above the cold, heavy air near the ground. This invisible ceiling trapped everything beneath it: smoke from homes, exhaust from buses, fumes from factories, and the soot from power plants lining the Thames. Instead of rising, the pollution stayed close to the streets, slipping between buildings and pooling at intersections. The city continued its routine, unaware of the trap forming overhead. Meteorologists at the time had limited tools. Weather satellites did not exist. Forecasts relied on surface observations, hand-plotted charts, and experience. Reports mentioned still air, low winds, and high humidity, the usual ingredients for a foggy weekend. But nothing suggested danger. Fog was expected. Fog was normal. In the power stations, the coal burned constantly. Britain's post-war demand for electricity was higher than ever. The fuel was low grade, producing more smoke and sulfur than the country's older, cleaner coal ever had. Chimneys belched thick, dark plumes into the motionless sky, adding to the growing mixture sitting above the city. At street level, Londoners noticed a familiar haziness settling in. Bus conductors squinted to read signs. Drivers leaned forward, peering over their steering wheels. Fog formed earlier in the day, clinging to the pavement in a way that felt unusually heavy, but no one saw reason to worry. In many neighborhoods, people burned even more fuel to fight the cold that seeped through thin walls. Old, inefficient fireplaces drew poorly, sending smoke back into the streets instead of up the chimney. Residents coughed more than usual, blaming the winter. Near the river, dock workers moved slowly through the thickening air, unaware that visibility had already begun to drop hour by hour. The smell of sulfur became sharper, though many attributed it to the usual factory output. London's air had been foul for generations. To most, this simply felt like another winter day. As Friday approached, the stillness deepened. Wind speeds fell to almost nothing. The inversion layer remained locked in place above the city, sealing it in. Even a modest breeze could have begun to clear the air, but none came. Instead, the fog grew denser. It absorbed more pollutants, turning from pale gray to a darker, more opaque shade. Street lamps glowed only a few feet into the mist. Shadows disappeared. Objects blurred. By nightfall, a strange quiet settled over the city. a kind of muffled silence that made the world feel smaller, enclosed. Animals behaved oddly. Horses hesitated at intersections. Cattle in markets became restless. Flock birds avoided flying low, but people carried on. There had been fog like this before, they thought. London had always been a city of soot and smoke, coal and chimneys, mist and river air, and yet this time the ingredients had combined in a way the city had never experienced. A perfect storm of cold pollution and atmospheric stillness, all of it invisible, all of it waiting. As Friday night turned into Saturday morning, the fog stopped behaving like weather. It no longer drifted. It no longer moved. It settled. It thickened. And it stayed. By Friday morning, December 5th, the fog had become part of the day. It lay over London like a blanket, low and unmoving. From upstairs windows, people could see little beyond the rooftops across the street. Lampposts vanished halfway up the pole, but still, it looked familiar enough. London in winter. People dressed for work as usual. They wrapped scarves around their necks, buttoned heavy coats, pulled on gloves worn thin at the fingertips. Fires were stoked again in countless homes. Fresh coal was thrown onto grates, filling chimneys with another surge of smoke. When doors opened, the outside world felt closer than usual. The air pressed in. The fog seemed to sit right in front of people's faces, not at a distance. It had a taste, bitter, sharp, metallic. Some paused on their doorsteps, coughed once, and stepped out anyway. On the main roads, buses moved slowly. Drivers leaned out of open windows, trying to see the curb. Conductors walked ahead of buses in the thickest patches, guiding them through intersections with hand signals and shouts. It was inconvenient, but not yet alarming. Londoners were used to improvising around the weather. The first real sign that something was wrong was how quickly visibility disappeared. Usually fog came and went in waves, thinner in some places, thicker in others. But on this day, it did not lift, it did not drift. It simply grew denser. By midday, pedestrians could no longer see across the street. Shops on the opposite side of the road vanished into a yellow-brown wall. Signs hanging above doorways were visible only at arm's length. Some people walked with one hand trailing along the brickwork, using the rough surface as a guide. Inside, the fog was no longer staying outside. It slipped under door frames and around window panes, bringing its smell into living rooms and kitchens. In some homes, visibility indoors shrank as the day went on. Families watched as familiar spaces faded into a kind of twilight, even with the lights on. In theaters, the air grew thick enough that the audience began to notice the stage softening at the edges. By evening, in some venues, actors were performing behind a veil of haze. Voices could be heard, faces could not be seen clearly. Several performances were canceled because the audience literally couldn't see the show. On the streets, people resorted to walking at a fraction of their usual pace. Some held handkerchiefs over their mouths. Others used scarves as makeshift masks. The fog clung to fabric, leaving clothes smelling strongly of smoke and sulfur. Police officers and traffic wardens found themselves nearly blind at intersections. Hand signals were useless when no one could see more than a step away. Cars and buses crawled. Drivers rolled down their windows, listening more than looking, for footsteps, for hooves, for engines. Accidents still happened. People walked into moving vehicles they never saw coming. Animals fared badly. Cattle at the Smithfield market coughed and stumbled. Horses refused to move forward in some streets. Dogs got lost within a few blocks of their homes. In hospitals, the first day passed with concern, but without panic. Doctors and nurses noticed more patients arriving with breathing difficulties, the young, the old, and those with chronic lung conditions. But the increase could still be explained away by cold weather and seasonal illness. Beds filled gradually. Staff made notes. Few connected their charts to the fog outside. By nightfall, Londoners began to talk about the fog in a different tone. It was no longer simply inconvenient or theatrical. It was odd. It felt wrong. The color was off, not soft gray, but a murky yellow-brown. The smell was harsher, like burnt metal and exhaust mixed together. The fog seemed to get into the throat and sit there, stubborn, refusing to clear. And yet, there were no official warnings, no radio announcements, no government bulletins urging people to stay inside. Work was expected to continue. Shops stayed open as long as they could. People made their way home, one careful step at a time, trusting that by morning the fog would finally lift. But that night, as lamps glowed faintly within their own halos of light, the fog did not move. It thickened. It settled deeper into the streets, the alleys, the lungs of the city. The first day ended not with sirens or alarms, but with a simple, quiet unease, a feeling that London's familiar mist had turned into something else, something heavier, something that was no longer just weather. By the second day, the fog had taken control of London in a way few had imagined possible. What began as a thick haze had become a physical barrier, something that didn't simply obscure the world, but reshaped it. The city no longer operated on sight, it operated on touch, sound, and caution. Early on Saturday morning, buses attempted to begin their routes as usual, but most made it only a few streets before stopping. Drivers couldn't see the road markings, they couldn't see the curb, they couldn't see the person guiding them. Some conductors walked in front of vehicles with small lanterns, but even these dim points of light were swallowed whole by the fog after just a meter or two. At busy intersections, traffic wardens raised their white gloves out of habit, though no one was close enough to see them. Cars rolled forward slowly, unsure when pedestrians might appear. Drivers leaned out their windows, listening for footsteps, for hoofbeats, for anything that hinted at another presence in the street. Collisions were frequent, but often so soft and slow that horns weren't used. Sound didn't carry normally. Everything felt muted. The Thames, normally lined with ships and barges, became a ghostly corridor. River traffic halted almost entirely. Foghorns droned endlessly, their low pitches vibrating through nearby buildings. Even so, several vessels drifted off course, unable to see more than the bow of their own ship. Above the city, Heathrow Airport, still young in 1952, suspended flights in and out. Runways disappeared beneath the fog. Pilots refused to attempt landings. Planes circled, diverted, or remained grounded. There was simply no way to navigate. At the train stations, delays stretched into hours. Platform signs vanished into yellow haze. Commuters waited in shivering groups, peering into the mist for headlights that never appeared. Conductors walked the tracks slowly, searching for signals that were now invisible. Inside the city's shops, owners lit additional lamps, but the glow barely pushed back the darkness. Merchants laid cloths over their goods to protect them from grime and soot drifting indoors. Customers moved carefully, guided by the sound of voices rather than sight. Some stores closed early, not for lack of will, but because fog seeped through cracks and settled over everything like a damp ash. Theaters, long a refuge from London's gray winters, found themselves overtaken by the same gloom. Fog slipped through entrances every time a door opened, filling auditoriums and dimming the stage. Actors performed behind a murky veil. Audiences coughed. Lighting crews raised the wattage, but the fog only glowed thicker. By evening, most venues canceled their shows, simply because the stage could no longer be seen. Hospitals, meanwhile, felt the strain more acutely. Ambulances moved so slowly that many never reached their destination. Drivers could not distinguish street signs from shadows. In several cases, patients were carried to hospitals by hand, guided only by memory of the streets and the faint outline of nearby buildings. Inside emergency rooms, doctors noticed rising numbers of people struggling to breathe. Some arrived with faces covered in soot, others clutched their chests, unable to take a full breath. Still, the pattern was subtle enough that no formal alarm was raised. London's nightlife came to a halt as well. Cabs refused fares after it became clear they could not navigate safely. Public dances and music halls emptied early. Restaurants operated in dim pockets of visibility, their windows glowing faintly like lanterns adrift at sea. By Saturday evening, the city seemed to be holding its breath. London, a metropolis of millions, moved at the pace of a small village during a power outage. People walked home by following walls, fences, or the sound of distant footsteps. Some became disoriented only a few meters from their front doors. Others stood still for several minutes until they recognized a familiar shape emerging from the fog. The smog didn't just stop traffic or close shops, it slowed the rhythm of life itself. Time felt stretched, distance felt distorted. A journey of a few blocks could take half an hour, and through it all, the fog never lifted, not for a moment, not for a breath. It hung over London with an unblinking stillness that was beginning to unsettle even the most stoic residents. By the end of the second day, the city understood one thing clearly. This wasn't ordinary fog. This wasn't weather. It was a force, and it was tightening its grip. By the third day, the fog no longer felt like an inconvenience or even an obstruction. It felt like something alive, a presence moving through the streets, entering homes, and settling deep in the lungs of the city. The air had grown thicker overnight. What had once been a dense haze was now a nearly solid mass, a fog so heavy that people described it as tangible, like walking through wet wool or smoke from a dying fire. The smell had changed too. It was sharper, more acidic, with a sting that clung to the back of the throat. Londoners woke up coughing. Some blamed the cold, others blamed poor quality coal. Most still believed the fog would lift at any moment, but as they stepped outside, it became immediately clear that the situation had worsened in ways no one had anticipated. Visibility had shrunk again. What had been a few yards of sight was now measured in inches. People held lanterns in front of them and watched the light dissolve before it reached the ground. Even indoors, lamps flickered weakly, their glow swallowed by the lingering smog drifting through open cracks. On the streets, the fog seemed to sit just above the pavement, like a blanket pressed tightly against the ground. Pedestrians felt the air change as they dropped into lower areas, pockets where the smog pooled, thicker and heavier, turning breathing into effort. Coughing became constant. For some, it was a dry, sharp hack. For others, it came with a rattling sound deep in the chest. The weakest residents felt it first. The elderly, those with chronic breathing conditions, and people who had survived the respiratory illnesses of wartime. Their symptoms escalated quickly: tightness in the chest, dizziness, and sudden breathlessness. Hospitals began seeing more patients than they could properly handle. Waiting rooms filled with people bent forward, clutching their knees as they struggled to take in air that no longer felt like air at all. Some wore damp cloths over their mouths, others cupped their hands around their faces, attempting to filter out the soot. Ambulances had become nearly useless. Drivers could not navigate the streets, and even when they did, the smog crept into the vehicles, filling the cabins with fumes as harmful as the air outside. Many calls went unanswered. Some patients were carried to hospitals by neighbors who took turns guiding each other through the fog. In livestock markets, animals collapsed. Sheep lay down and didn't get up. Cattle shivered and wheezed. Horses stopped in their tracks, refusing to move forward into the thickest sections of smog. For many Londoners, the sounds of animals in distress were the first warning that something deeper was wrong. Train stations fared little better. Trains moved at a crawl, or not at all. Conductors walked the tracks ahead of engines, feeling their way along metal rails. Journeys that once took minutes stretched into hours if they happened at all. Inside homes, the smog was everywhere. Curtains absorbed it, bed sheets smelled of it. Cooking became difficult, not because of a lack of food, but because fires only added more smoke to the air. Families ate cold meals or small portions of bread and tea, trying not to worsen the atmosphere indoors. For some, the fog caused disorientation. People got lost in alleys they had walked 1,000 times. Some stood in confusion until someone emerged beside them, guiding them slowly to familiar landmarks. By afternoon, doctors began to realize the nature of the crisis. The fog wasn't just blocking vision, it was changing the chemistry of the air. Sulfur dioxide, smoke particles, nitrogen oxides, and acidic aerosols combined to form a toxic mixture, far more dangerous than ordinary pollution. But without the ability to measure or model air quality the way modern science can, the realization arrived slowly and too late. Reports started circulating informally, people collapsing in the streets, breathless, bodies being carried from homes, patients dying before reaching the hospital. Still, the government made no official announcement. There were no warnings, no restrictions, no calls to remain indoors. Life was expected to continue, even as the city fought to draw breath. By the end of the third day, London was no longer simply shrouded in smog, it was suffocating beneath it. Each inhale came with effort, each step felt heavier. The air had turned against its own people, and the fog, unmoved and unchanging, continued to thicken. While the streets of London grew quieter, the corridors of its hospitals grew crowded. On the third and fourth day of the smog, people arrived in a steady, unbroken stream. Some walked in on their own, one hand pressed to their chest, the other gripping a railing or a family member's arm. Others were carried in on stretchers or makeshift litters, doors taken from their hinges, shutters repurposed as boards, blankets knotted into slings. Inside, the air was only slightly better than outside. The smog filtered in through every opening, cracks in window frames, gaps around doors, ventilation shafts never meant to handle such a burden. Corridors that were usually bright under fluorescent lights became dim, the beams softened and swallowed by a faint yellow haze. Doctors and nurses noticed patterns. Patients arrived with the same complaints: tightness in the chest, burning sensations in the throat, heavy, labored breathing. Their lips sometimes carried a faint bluish tint. Many had pre-existing conditions: bronchitis, asthma, heart disease, but some had never been seriously ill before. The smog did not discriminate. In emergency wards, beds filled quickly. When those ran out, patients were laid on stretchers along the walls. Medical staff moved between them in quiet, efficient circuits, checking pulses, listening to lungs, adjusting oxygen supplies where available. The sound of coughing and wheezing became a constant background noise, as steady as the ticking of clocks on the wall. There were problems beyond crowding. Medical equipment of the early 1950s had limits. Oxygen supplies were finite. Ventilation machines were rare and not designed for mass use in a crisis like this. Masks existed, but not in quantities that could cover everyone in need. Doctors did what they could with what they had. Some hospital staff wore damp cloths over their own mouths and noses as they worked. They coughed too, wiped stinging eyes, and felt their chest tighten after hours of breathing the same air. But they kept moving, kept checking, kept writing notes in neat lines on charts that would later tell the story in numbers: blood pressure, pulse, respiration, time of death. Ambulances, when they managed to move at all, arrived late and left later. Their sirens were of limited use. The sound did not travel the way it should in the dense smog, and even when it did, drivers could barely see the road in front of them. Many calls simply never reached hospitals. People died at home, in bed or at the table. surrounded by air that looked harmless until it was drawn into the lungs. In some districts, doctors began making rough calculations. They compared admissions from ordinary winter days with the current surge. Numbers that should have been stable had doubled, then tripled. Heart attacks, asthma attacks, acute respiratory failure, all of them rising together. One nurse later described it simply: we were not seeing different illnesses, we were seeing more of them, and faster. Temporary wards were set up where space could be found, in hallways, side rooms, even converted storage areas. Blankets were pulled from cupboards, cots dragged out, anything that could support a patient pressed into service. Hospitals that were already stretched thin by the demands of post-war Britain now found themselves operating beyond their limits. Still, there was no clear moment when someone stood up and declared a disaster. The recognition came gradually, as staff realized that each day brought not a peak, but a new baseline. What had seemed like an anomaly on the first day became the norm by the third. Communication between hospitals was imperfect. Each saw only its own overload. Only later would the broader picture emerge, that nearly every hospital in London was under similar siege, each one handling a piece of the same invisible crisis. Outside, the smog continued to press against the windows, a constant reminder that the cause of this sudden suffering was not a virus, not a contagion, not a battlefield injury. It was the air itself. Doctors wrote in their reports about exacerbation of chronic conditions and acute respiratory failure. They noted that patients improved when moved temporarily to cleaner environments and declined quickly when returned to the fog. Some physicians began to suspect that the smog was lethal in its own right, not merely an irritant. But suspicion did not change the day's work. Patients still arrived, rooms still filled, monitors still ticked quietly beside beds, measuring the slow, uneven rhythms of lungs under siege. As the third day turned into the fourth, the staff grew more tired, shifts blurred, meals were skipped, voices grew hoarse, not just from giving orders in comfort, but from breathing the same tainted air. In the end, what hospitals faced was not a sudden wave that crashed and receded. It was a steady flood, rising inch by inch with no visible end. The beds were full, the halls were crowded, the city outside was choking, and the smog still refused to lift. By the fourth day, the smog had become more than an environmental event. It had become a shared experience, something every Londoner felt, breathed, and tried to navigate in their own way. People began speaking of it not as the fog, but as this thing, a presence moving through the city with weight and intention. Those who ventured outside did so slowly, often reluctantly. Conversations drifted between neighbors on street corners, spoken in hushed tones, as though the fog might hear them. The words they used were simple, but the impressions lingered. A shopkeeper from the East End recalled stepping out early in the morning to lift the shutters of his store. He described the world as shrunk, as though the street had been folded in on itself. He could see only the first few paving stones in front of his feet. Beyond that, everything dissolved into a solid curtain of color, a heavy yellow-brown that made his eyes water. A bus conductor described how sound behaved strangely. Voices seemed to come from nowhere, echoing oddly against the invisible walls of fog. He said he could hear footsteps long before he could see the person making them, and that sometimes the footsteps never materialized at all. A seamstress in Southwark told her family that her living room looked like someone had blown dust into the air. She wiped her table, opened the curtains, and saw the fog drifting into the room as though it belonged there. By midday, she had lit every lamp she owned, yet the room never brightened. In Soho, a butcher described the smell as the worst part. Not the visibility, not the difficulty of working by lantern, but the constant sour odor in the air. Part smoke, part chemicals, part something he couldn't name. He began to cough halfway through the day and locked the shop, something he had never done on a Saturday. A nurse walking to her shift at St. Thomas's Hospital said she kept one hand on the building walls the entire way. The fog was so thick she never saw a single car, though she heard several pass by within a few feet. She spoke later of hearing muffled coughing in the alleys, not loud, not close, just scattered sounds of people struggling somewhere in the haze. An elderly man in Lambeth recalled hearing a horse collapse on the road. He never saw the animal, only the outline of legs, then the thud, then silence. He stood in the fog for several minutes, waiting for someone else to appear. No one did. People began to rely on touch. Hands slid along brick walls, fences, the edges of parked cars. Some carried walking sticks and tapped the pavement ahead of them. A few tied ropes to their door handles and held the other end as they walked down the steps, ensuring they could find their way back. Inside pubs, patrons spoke in low voices about the worst fog I've seen, though many had lived through the famous pea soupers of decades past. But this one did not behave like those. This fog felt heavier, damp but not wet, warm but not comforting, alive in a way that made people uneasy. One woman from Kensington described the moment she lit a candle in her kitchen and realized the flame didn't illuminate the room. It glowed weakly, surrounded by a sphere of light no bigger than her fist. Beyond that small radius, the darkness remained unchanged. A young doctor traveling between clinics told colleagues he could smell the fog inside his surgical mask. He said the air tasted metallic, as though he were breathing through iron filings. Coal workers, accustomed to dust and soot, said even they were surprised. One described the fog as breath you had to swallow before you could breathe it. And yet, despite these remarks, people still tried to continue with their routines. Children stayed home from school, but many adults went to work or attempted to. Shops opened late, churches held services with half-empty pews, and families cooked meals with windows closed tight against the outside. These personal impressions, simple observations, shared quietly, would later become vital pieces of evidence. They showed how the smog was experienced not through dramatic events, but through thousands of small, unsettling moments that accumulated over days. Londoners did not speak in terms of crisis or catastrophe. They spoke of sore throats, lost landmarks, strange smells, and the feeling that the world had shrunk. Life continued, but something inside the city had begun to crack, not suddenly, but gradually, as if the fog were pressing not only on lungs, but on the rhythm of daily life. By evening, the number of stories increased. So did the worry. London was struggling to breathe, and its people were beginning to understand that they were struggling with it. As the smog deepened and hospitals filled, the British government maintained a tone of calm familiarity. Fog, after all, was nothing new to London. It had shaped the city's identity for centuries, in paintings, in literature, in everyday life. Officials saw no reason to believe that this episode was anything other than another winter nuisance. Reports from the ground were slow to reach the desks of senior officials, not because people weren't speaking, but because the city's communication systems were as impaired as its streets. Telephone lines crackled, telegraph messages were delayed, and vehicles carrying written reports moved so slowly through the smog that some never arrived at all. Local authorities sent notices describing poor air quality, limited visibility, and transport disruptions, but none of those phrases sounded catastrophic. They sounded routine, the sort of language used in countless winter updates. On the second day, when visibility dropped below a few feet in most districts, a few city councilors urged the Ministry of Health to issue a public warning. They proposed advising people to stay indoors unless necessary and recommending the use of cloth masks, but higher-level officials hesitated. They feared causing unnecessary alarm. They also believed the situation would resolve itself once the weather changed. Forecasts predicted a shift in wind patterns, perhaps by Sunday, so the government waited. Meanwhile, the fog thickened. In Parliament, the matter was barely mentioned. Ongoing debates about rationing, housing, and post-war spending consumed most attention. Air quality was viewed as an issue of discomfort, not danger. The Ministry of Works acknowledged that Britain's coal supply was low quality and smoky, but upgrading fuel sources was a long-term problem, far beyond the scope of an immediate response. Even as hospitals quietly began filling, and doctors spoke of a sharp increase in respiratory cases, official statements remained guarded. A brief note issued by the Ministry of Health mentioned seasonal respiratory difficulties and advised vulnerable individuals to avoid strenuous activity. It did not mention smog or pollution. Some civil servants were aware of the early numbers coming from hospitals, but without a clear system for tracking deaths in real time, they underestimated the severity. Winter always brought more respiratory cases. Increases were expected. No one had yet connected the patterns emerging in different districts. Transport authorities were more direct, but still restrained. They suspended bus routes and closed parts of the underground for safety, but these were described as temporary disruptions due to dense fog. No broader alarm was raised. Meanwhile, Londoners were inventing their own solutions: wet scarves over mouths, walking with hands against walls, avoiding low-lying areas where the smog pooled heaviest. None of this made it into official guidance. By the third day, some within the government began to feel uneasy. A handful of doctors sent urgent letters describing patients collapsing from apparent oxygen deprivation, not simply irritation. A few hospitals reported mortality rates rising beyond seasonal expectations, but without centralized data, these remained isolated observations. No one had the full picture. The Ministry of Health waited for weather to improve. Meteorologists waited for wind that never came. The public waited for guidance that wasn't issued. In a meeting late on Saturday, officials briefly considered whether the fog might be more dangerous than previously assumed. But the discussion ended with a familiar conclusion. It was weather. It would pass. The government neither warned nor acted, not from malice, but from the slow machinery of bureaucracy, a reluctance to name a disaster while it was still unfolding, a belief that advice could cause panic, and a deep-seated assumption that London would simply endure. Outside, the fog continued to thicken, hospitals continued to fill, and the city, left without direction, carried on in silence, waiting for a change in the wind that stayed still for days. While officials debated terminology and meteorologists waited for a shift in the wind, the smog was already taking its toll, not with sudden shocks or visible violence, but through a steady accumulation of small, quiet moments, one breath at a time. Many of the first victims were older adults, people who had lived through war, rationing, illness, and hard winters. Their bodies were already tired, and the toxic fog strained them further. Some passed away in their beds overnight, their families believing they had simply succumbed to age. The connection to the smog wasn't immediately obvious. Doctors began to notice patterns in the charts. Patients who had been stable for weeks suddenly experienced severe breathing difficulties. Individuals with chronic bronchitis deteriorated rapidly. Those with weak hearts struggled the most, as their cardiovascular systems labored against the polluted air. At first, the increases were explained away. A spike in winter mortality was not unusual. Cold weather always brought risks, but as the numbers rose sharply on the third day, the familiar explanations no longer held. In many neighborhoods, people reported hearing coughing through the night, not the occasional winter cough, but deep, persistent fits echoing from upstairs rooms and across thin apartment walls. Some families took turns sitting awake, listening to the breathing of elderly relatives, uncertain whether they should attempt a walk to the hospital or stay inside where the air felt only slightly less suffocating. Along major roads, pedestrians were found collapsed on pavements. Some were discovered within a few meters of their homes, unable to navigate the thick fog long enough to reach shelter. Doctors later said that many died of a simple, brutal chain reaction. The air irritated their lungs. The lungs failed to take in enough oxygen. The heart tried to compensate, and eventually it gave out. In several cases, people passed out in the street before help could arrive. The ambulance delays, sometimes lasting hours, meant that even those found quickly were often beyond saving. Drivers did their best to move through the haze, but the smog swallowed headlights and muted sirens until the vehicles were nearly upon the scene. Some of the most tragic stories came from those who lived alone. Neighbors found them days later, lying near doors or windows cracked open in an attempt to let in fresh air. But fresh air never came. Doctors in overburdened hospitals kept handwritten logs of the cases they saw. Chest tightness, wheezing, sudden fainting, severe shortness of breath, all rising together. Some records listed causes of death as cardiac failure, respiratory collapse, or complications of chronic illness. The term smog rarely appeared. At that time, the connection was still murky. Meanwhile, mortuaries began to feel pressure. Staff noticed that by Sunday, bodies were arriving more quickly than usual. Phones rang with requests to prepare additional space, though few understood the full scope of the situation. Many victims didn't reach the hospital at all. They died in armchairs, on staircases, at kitchen tables, or in taxis, stuck in traffic jams, made worse by the fog. Some passed away holding scarves or handkerchiefs to their faces, as though they might filter just enough air to make it through another hour. And still, no citywide alert was issued. People walked through the smog each day, unaware that the danger was growing. No radio broadcast warned of the toxic air. Newspapers mentioned heavy fog, but did not describe its deadly effects. The government had said too little too late, and the public had no reason to suspect that the air itself was killing them. As Sunday turned into Monday, the death toll, though largely unseen and unacknowledged, continued to rise. Thousands were sick, hundreds were gone, and the smog had not weakened. It pressed down on London with the same unmoving density, trapping its people beneath a cloud they could neither escape nor understand. The deaths did not come with dramatic scenes or urgent headlines. They came quietly, steadily, in living rooms, hospital beds, and streets that looked empty but were filled with danger. It was a disaster in slow motion, a silent toll still climbing. On the morning of December 9th, after 4 days without a hint of wind, a change finally came. Not loudly, not suddenly, but with a subtle shift in the air that Londoners sensed before they fully saw it. Windows that had been dim for days brightened slightly. Lamp posts regained their outlines. The dense yellow-brown wall that had swallowed entire neighborhoods began to thin at the edges. It didn't lift all at once. Instead, the fog loosened, stretching into long, pale ribbons drifting upward, as though the city were exhaling after days of holding its breath. By noon, the first weak sunlight in nearly a week filtered through the haze. It wasn't strong enough to warm the streets, but it created a sense of space, the return of depth, distance, and shapes. People stepped outside and squinted up at a sky they hadn't seen in days, watching patches of blue flicker through the thinning fog. For the first time since Friday, buildings reappeared beyond a few feet. Vehicles emerged from the mist like forgotten monuments. Church spires and chimneys regained their form, stretching upward into air that looked cleaner with every passing hour. Some residents cried with relief, though not loudly. Others simply stood at their doorsteps, breathing deeply and slowly, not because the air was yet clean, but because the crushing weight of the smog had finally begun to lift. Streets that had gone silent began to fill with the small sounds of ordinary life. Footsteps echoed again, shop doors creaked open, the muffled, swallowed voices of the past 4 days turned sharper, clearer. Birds, absent for the duration of the smog, returned cautiously, their shapes barely perceptible against the remaining haze. But as visibility improved, a different reality emerged. The smog had begun to clear, but the consequences remained. Hospitals that had struggled for days were now overwhelmed. Patients continued arriving, many of them worsening, even as the air brightened. Doctors recognized that the damage done to the lungs and hearts of the most vulnerable would not simply evaporate with the fog. Some who had endured the smog's worst effects now faced delayed complications: pneumonia, infections, cardiac strain. Beds were full, hallways crowded, and medical staff exhausted. In morgues across the city, the backlog became painfully clear. What had been hundreds of unconnected deaths during the smog were now counted together. Storage space ran low. Officials quietly requested additional facilities. Families lined up to identify relatives, still unsure how so many could have died during what was officially described as an episode of severe weather. Outside, London tried to resume its rhythm. Buses restarted routes. Trains attempted to return to schedule, though many services remained delayed. Shops reopened, sweeping away the layers of soot that had drifted indoors. People walked the streets, pointing to places where they had become disoriented days earlier. But everywhere, the city bore marks of what it had endured. Animals that had collapsed in markets were cleared away. Cars abandoned in the worst of the smog were retrieved. Homes were aired out, though the smell of sulfur lingered stubbornly. And in many households, families faced the shock of discovering that a relative, grandmother, father, neighbor had grown ill or passed away during the smog's peak. Some deaths that occurred at home were only now being recognized, especially in poorer districts where medical care had been difficult to reach. As sunlight strengthened and wind finally moved through the city, blowing away the last remnants of the toxic fog, Londoners looked around and realized the scale of what had happened. For 4 days, the city had been suffocating. For 4 days, thousands had struggled quietly in rooms dimmed by poison. And now, as the light returned, the truth began to surface, not in dramatic scenes, but in the slow accumulation of stories, hospital records, and silence. When the sun returned, London breathed easier, but it also began to understand the cost of those breaths. When the fog began to clear, Londoners expected the city to recover quickly. The sun had returned. Traffic was moving again. Shops reopened. Life, on the surface, appeared to resume its familiar rhythm. But inside hospitals, morgues, and public offices, a different picture emerged. One that was harder to see, harder to accept, and far more devastating than anyone had realized during those 4 days of darkness. The first official reports, compiled hastily as the smog thinned, listed a few hundred deaths. These were individuals who had passed away in hospitals or under medical observation during the most severe days. Their conditions were clear: respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, complications from chronic illness exacerbated by extreme pollution. But these early numbers were incomplete. They reflected only the cases that had reached the attention of medical staff, not the quiet tragedies that unfolded in homes, tenements, and care facilities across the city. As the days passed, and as families notified authorities, the toll began to climb. Doctors reviewing records noticed a sudden spike in death certificates dated December 5th through December 9th. General practitioners who made house calls filed reports of patients who had deteriorated rapidly without the usual warning signs. Nurses spoke of long nights when multiple beds fell silent within hours of each other. Officials at local registrars' offices found themselves dealing with volumes far exceeding what a typical week in December would bring. Clerks processed forms that listed causes like bronchial spasm, congestive failure, asphyxia, and respiratory collapse, many from individuals with no prior history of acute illness. Mortuaries became crowded. Staff discreetly requested more space, additional attendants, and transportation services. Newspapers did not print the details yet, but those working behind the scenes felt the weight of something unprecedented. Still, no single office had the full overview. London was vast. Deaths were recorded in separate districts. Hospitals did not share data quickly. Communication moved slowly, burdened by the same fog that had crippled the city days earlier. It wasn't until weeks later, when epidemiologists and public health officials began compiling comprehensive statistics, that the scale of the disaster became unmistakable. More than 4,000 people had died in the immediate days of the smog. And as they dug deeper into the numbers from the following weeks, the count rose even higher. Individuals who had appeared to survive the worst of the smog developed pneumonia, severe infections, and long-term cardiac complications. These secondary effects, though delayed, were direct consequences of the toxic air they had breathed. By the time the final reports were assembled, the estimate had grown dramatically. Some experts concluded that the Great Smog had claimed over 12,000 lives. Others argued the number was even higher, that thousands more had died indirectly, through exacerbated illnesses or conditions never formally linked to the fog. The government, faced with these findings, struggled to reconcile them with its initial understanding of the event. Officials had assumed the fog was just another winter episode. Now they were confronted with evidence of a public health catastrophe far beyond anything the city had seen in peacetime. For many families, the counting came long after the loss. The days between the smog's arrival and its clearing had been filled with confusion. They had not realized that the air itself could be lethal. Some blamed the cold, others blamed weakness. Only later did they understand that thousands across London had experienced the same sudden decline. The numbers were not dramatic in the way disasters are often imagined. There were no collapsed buildings, no explosions, no fire. The deaths were quiet, individual, isolated, and easy to overlook until they were added together. But once counted, the total revealed a truth that shocked even the experts. The Great Smog of 1952 had become one of the deadliest environmental disasters in modern history, and the toll continued to rise long after the fog had lifted. When the streets cleared and the last traces of the smog drifted away, the work of understanding it was only beginning. For most Londoners, the Great Smog of 1952 was an experience, something they had walked through, coughed through, and tried to survive. For doctors, meteorologists, and public health officials, it became a problem to be measured, explained, and if possible, prevented from happening again. In the weeks that followed, reports began to move between hospitals, registrars, and government departments. Data that had first appeared fragmented and local now started to form a pattern. Lines on charts rose sharply during the same 4-day period. Respiratory deaths, heart failures, emergency admissions all showed the same spike. Scientists asked a simple question: what was different about those days? Meteorologists pored over their logs. They examined barometric readings, temperature profiles, and wind records. They noted the unusual stability of the air above London, the temperature inversion that had trapped the city under a lid of warm air. Fog, they knew, was common, but a fog that refused to disperse for days, combined with a complete lack of wind, was rare. Chemists and environmental scientists turned their attention to the composition of the air itself. They collected residual soot from buildings, looked at filter samples from power stations and industrial stacks, and examined the chemical signatures left behind on surfaces exposed to the smog. Gradually, a picture formed. The fog had not been just moisture. It had been a chemical mixture, a dense suspension of particles and gases produced by burning coal. The low-quality fuel used in power stations and home fireplaces had released large quantities of sulfur dioxide, which in moist, stagnant air could combine with other compounds to form sulfuric acid droplets. Suspended in the fog, they were inhaled deep into the lungs. Smoke particles themselves, tiny bits of unburned carbon and ash, carried toxic substances on their surfaces. These particles penetrated airways, irritated tissue, and triggered inflammatory responses in anyone breathing them for long periods. To people on the ground, the smog had looked like weather. To scientists, it increasingly looked like an episode of acute mass poisoning. In medical journals, early articles began to propose a direct connection between air pollution and the mortality spike. Physicians described cases in which patients with chronic respiratory conditions decompensated rapidly during the smog, and in which relatively stable cardiac patients suffered sudden fatal strain. Some researchers went further, suggesting that the Great Smog might only be the most visible example of a deeper long-term problem, that London's air, even on ordinary days, was slowly harming its residents. At first, these ideas met resistance. Air pollution was familiar. Coal smoke had been part of London's identity for as long as anyone could remember. The notion that something so ordinary could become so deadly was uncomfortable. It challenged assumptions about industry, home life, and even culture, yet the numbers were difficult to ignore. Graphs showing deaths over time did not lie. Whenever weather conditions trapped pollution close to the ground, mortality rose. The 1952 episode had simply been the most extreme example, a perfect convergence of emissions and atmosphere. In laboratories and offices, scientists worked quietly, assembling evidence, writing reports, and testifying before committees. They described dose-response relationships, explained how lungs reacted to fine particles, and outlined the mechanical ways in which the heart and circulatory system struggled under constant chemical assault. They did not speak in the language of moral judgment. They spoke in the language of data, tables, charts, and carefully phrased conclusions. Their findings gradually reshaped the public conversation. What had first been called a freak fog or an unfortunate episode became something more specific, a preventable tragedy, not caused by a single failure, but by a system that had accepted polluted air as the cost of progress. The Great Smog of London became a case study, a reference point for scientists around the world. It offered a stark example of what happens when emissions from millions of small fires and large industrial sources are trapped in one place for too long. In time, these scientific insights would be used to argue for stricter controls on emissions, cleaner fuels, and redesigned cities. But in the immediate years following the smog, their first task was simpler and more fundamental: to show that air could kill, not metaphorically, not in poetic language, but directly, with every breath. In the months after the Great Smog lifted, the urgency of the disaster slowly gave way to the routines of daily life. Shops reopened, traffic returned, factories resumed their schedules. For many Londoners, the temptation to forget, to treat the smog as an unfortunate but isolated episode, was strong. But for scientists, doctors, and a growing number of public officials, forgetting was not an option. The numbers were too stark, the evidence too clear. The smog had not been a curiosity, it had been a warning. In early 1953, parliamentary committees began gathering testimony. Doctors described crowded hospital corridors and patients whose lungs had simply stopped being able to function. Nurses spoke of nights when the wards felt overwhelmed, not by noise or chaos, but by the steady, quiet arrival of people who could no longer breathe. Meteorologists explained the atmospheric conditions that had trapped pollution over the city. Environmental scientists detailed the chemical makeup of the air during the smog. They spoke of sulfur dioxide, sulfuric acid droplets, soot particles, and nitrogen oxides, terms unfamiliar to most elected officials. Industry representatives approached the matter cautiously. Coal was still central to Britain's economy. Power stations, factories, and household fireplaces all depended on it, suggesting a reduction in coal use was politically sensitive and economically challenging. Yet as the hearings continued, a simple truth emerged. The status quo could not continue. Public awareness grew steadily throughout the year. Newspapers published editorials demanding accountability and reform. Letters from citizens, many of whom had lost family members, appeared in local papers. The phrase clean air entered political vocabulary in a way it never had before. One of the most influential voices was that of Dr. H.C. Pereira, a senior medical officer who testified that the 1952 smog had been a natural experiment of the most tragic sort, revealing the deadly consequences of unchecked air pollution. His calm, clinical tone made the findings even more striking. By 1954, momentum had built. Government working groups drafted proposals, debated enforcement, and consulted with scientists on realistic emission limits. The recommendations were gradual, not radical. Britain could not abandon coal overnight, but they marked the beginning of a significant shift. The proposals evolved into a legislative plan, the Clean Air Bill. Debated in Parliament through 1955, the bill faced opposition from some industrial interests and local councils worried about cost. But every time resistance mounted, someone pointed to the numbers, the thousands of lives lost, the thousands more affected, the undeniable evidence. In 1956, the Clean Air Act became law. The act introduced smoke control areas where only smokeless fuels could be burned. It required taller chimneys for industrial buildings to disperse emissions more effectively. It set limits on domestic coal burning during certain months and encouraged households to convert to cleaner fuels. Local authorities gained the power to inspect and enforce compliance. The Clean Air Act didn't change London overnight. The city still relied on coal for years. Some neighborhoods adapted quickly, while others took much longer, but the act represented a profound shift in the nation's relationship with its environment. It acknowledged that air pollution was not simply a nuisance or a natural part of city life. It was a public health issue, demanding action. The legislation became a model for other countries, influencing environmental policy across Europe and eventually contributing to the early frameworks of global air quality standards. In the end, the Clean Air Act was not just a response to a tragedy, it was a recognition that the tragedy had revealed something deeper and more enduring, that cities cannot ignore the air their people breathe, that progress without regulation carries hidden costs, and that the line between everyday pollution and disaster is thinner than most imagine. For London, the act marked the beginning of cleaner skies. For the world, it marked the first major step toward understanding that environmental protection is not an abstract ideal, it is a necessity, measured in human lives. Today, London bears little resemblance to the city that choked under the Great Smog of 1952. The air is cleaner, the skyline is sharper. The iconic fog that once rolled through its streets now appears only occasionally, and when it does, it is mostly moisture, not soot. For many residents, the idea that the air itself once turned toxic feels almost unreal, a distant chapter belonging to another era. Yet traces of that history remain. Along older streets, soot still clings to the brickwork above doorways and beneath eaves, faint reminders of the coal smoke that once coated every surface. Some public buildings display photographs of London shrouded in dense, yellow smog, images that look more like scenes from another world than from the city they stand in now. In museums and archives, visitors find letters from doctors who worked through those days, notes scribbled quickly between patients, their handwriting tight and hurried. There are newspaper clippings reporting travel disruptions without yet realizing the severity of the crisis. And there are graphs, stark and motionless, showing the sudden dramatic rise in deaths. In certain neighborhoods, older residents still remember the week when the fog refused to lift. Their memories are quiet, practical, unembellished. They recall walking by touch, hearing voices in the distance without seeing the faces, and coughing through nights when the air inside their homes seemed no safer than the air outside. Many speak not of fear, but of confusion, how something so familiar could become so dangerous without warning. London's transportation system, once paralyzed by the smog, now operates with advanced weather monitoring, air quality sensors, and real-time forecasting. Hospitals carry emergency protocols shaped by lessons learned from 1952, even if most staff today know the event only from training materials rather than experience. Environmental awareness, too, has changed. The Clean Air Act of 1956 has been revised and strengthened many times. Coal fires, once a defining part of London's winter evenings, have largely disappeared from homes. Industrial emissions are heavily regulated, and discussions about air quality now include vehicles, factories, construction, and even global climate mitigation, concepts that would have been unfamiliar to policymakers of the 1950s. In many ways, the Great Smog has faded from public consciousness. Tourists rarely hear about it when they visit the city. Guided tours focus on the Blitz, the Great Fire, the Tower of London, dramatic events with visible scars. The smog left no ruins, no craters, no charred remains. Its destruction was hidden in the lungs and hearts of its victims, invisible to the eye. For this reason, the memory of the Great Smog survives mostly in the realm of science, policy, and quiet reflection. It is a reminder not of flames or collapse, but of the dangers that come slowly and silently, dangers that rise not from sudden violence, but from neglect, routine, and the belief that what is familiar cannot be harmful. And yet the lessons of 1952 extend beyond London. Around the world, cities continue to struggle with air pollution, some experiencing episodes not unlike the smog of the past, though often on a smaller scale. The Great Smog remains a reference point, a case study, and a warning. Its legacy is woven into environmental law, medical research, and the growing recognition that human health and the atmosphere are linked more closely than people once believed. London today is proud of its cleaner skies, but the memory of that week in December still lingers in archives, testimonies, and the quiet stories of those who lived through it. It is a reminder that progress must be maintained, not assumed, and that the air that surrounds a city, invisible, constant, easily taken for granted, can shape its fate. The fog is gone, but its lesson remains. The Great Smog of 1952 did not leave behind ruins, burned districts, or shattered streets. There were no photographs of collapsed buildings or dramatic rescues, no monuments marking the places where the most lives were lost. Its damage unfolded in silence, a disaster measured not in rubble, but in breath. And perhaps that is why its lessons feel so profound. It revealed something cities had long ignored, that the atmosphere is not an empty backdrop, but a living part of daily life. Something shared by all, shaped by all, and vulnerable to the choices of millions of households and industries working in isolation, yet contributing to the same invisible burden. The smog demonstrated how fragile that balance can be. It showed that danger does not always arrive with noise or spectacle. Sometimes it comes quietly, settling over familiar streets, drifting through ordinary rooms, unnoticed until it has already done its work. In the years that followed, scientists, policymakers, and citizens learned to see the air differently. It became something measurable, manageable, and worth protecting. The Clean Air Act of 1956 was only the beginning. New standards were developed, New technologies adopted and new expectations formed about what a city should allow into the lungs of its people. Those changes have saved countless lives, not through dramatic intervention, but through prevention, averted harm, and the simple act of breathing cleaner air. They reshaped how governments think about the environment, public health, and responsibility, and they helped inspire the broader environmental movement that would emerge in the decades that followed. But the lesson remains relevant even now. Around the world, cities still grapple with air pollution. Factories, traffic, and rapid urban growth continue to push the limits of what the atmosphere can absorb. Episodes of poor air quality still occur, sometimes brief, sometimes prolonged, and scientists continue to warn that the line between discomfort and danger can be crossed quickly, often without notice. The Great Smog offers a reminder that progress is not permanent. Clean air must be protected deliberately, sustained through policy, planning, and awareness. It cannot be taken for granted. For London, the smog is now a memory, faded, distant, but quietly present in archives, in legislation, and in the stories of those who lived through it. For the world, it is a case study in what happens when the invisible becomes unavoidable. And for anyone listening, it is a gentle caution that the air we breathe connects us, that its quality shapes our health, our cities, and our future, and that sometimes the most important threats are the ones we cannot see. The fog lifted decades ago. The lesson it carried remains in the air still.